So data only changes the world when we use it to change behaviors. We are awash in information, and what we need is framing and context. Humans are great at storytelling. It's the original social media, a means of distributing ideas in ways that are easy to grasp. Our next speaker is a self-described data storyteller. He's the author of Info We Trust, How to Inspire the World with Data, and the creator of the Information Graphic Visionaries Kickstarter that blew its goal out of the water and raised nearly $125K to create a series of books about some of history's most spectacular data visualization creators. RJ Andrews is here to explain why Florence Nightingale is a data storytelling hero. Welcome, RJ. Hello, lovely to see you.
Good morning.
I'm excited. I've been looking forward to this story for some time now, so I'm going to leave it to you, and we'll see you at the end.
Okay. So as a professional data storyteller, there's one question I always ask. I ask it of myself, and I ask it of my teammates, my clients, and that is, compared to what? Because for a number to be meaningful, you need context. Think about Kate's talk. She said, quantum computing, 2 billion circuits. That sounds like a lot, but is it? Is it a lot? Is it a little? Compared to what? The brain needs comparisons for numbers to make sense. That's why we don't talk about datums. We talk about data because a singular piece of data, a datum, has no meaning whatsoever. Now, nobody understood compared to what better than Florence Nightingale. In 1856, Nightingale returned home from the Crimean War. Now, what she did there was very interesting. Her heroics are often misunderstood and too often misrepresented, but our job here today is not to look at Nightingale war service, but what happened immediately after. You see, during the war, careless, incompetent, and egotistical government elites caused the preventable deaths of thousands of their own people by ignoring sanitary health, building cleanliness, especially good sewers, and reduction in overcrowding. Nightingale noted that the horrors of war had nothing to do with the battlefield, and she was right. Men starved, men froze, and most famously, they died by preventable disease. Nightingale made it her mission to stop such a public health disaster from ever happening again. She wrote soon after her return, to see the men playing the game of party politics, all those government elites, on the graves of our brave dead, all the soldiers who died from preventable disease. You know, she wanted to prevent it from ever happening again, that colossal calamity. And finally, she said, if you could only see our real statistics. And of course, across the next couple of years, that's what she worked so hard to do, to convey, to show her the real statistics. So here's a simple example of one of the ways she showed those real statistics. It's a compound bar chart that appears in one of her first publications after the war. It compares the mortality rate of two populations, Englishmen, shown in the black bars, and English soldiers stationed at home in England, shown with red. The takeaway was that being a soldier is very dangerous, perhaps twice as dangerous, twice as deadly compared to staying out of the service. Nightingale's chart was more simple, but also more salient than competing information graphics of the time. Her chart had a better chance of attracting, engaging, and consequently persuading a normal reader. Now, she did not employ data visualization to empower the reader's exploration of the world. Her text and graphics pointed a narrative lens in a particular direction to convey specific claims. It was more than data visualization, it was data storytelling. But as you may already know, reading a simple, clear comparison is not the same as making one. You know, one of Nightingale's most important collaborators was Sidney Herbert. For us, it's good enough to know that Herbert was a statesman and a close confidant of Nightingale. To Herbert, Nightingale actually explained in writing the motivation for the diagrams. They were tools of persuasion designed for the less than statistically literate. Nightingale wrote that diagrams are to catch the sparrows. They are meant for unscientific readers who would not suffer rows and rows of statistical tables. But make no mistake, the audience was common and vulgar when it came to science, but it was not common otherwise. Queen Victoria, who Nightingale visited and sent copies of all of her charts, hovered large as target number one. This is one of my favorite Nightingale lines. It is our flank march upon the enemy, and it leaves them not a word to say. This is what you have done with the army. They cannot answer it. They can only deny. Nightingale's sentiment echoes the sentiment of the abolition movement 2 generations earlier, where William Wilberforce said to the House of Commons as he presented a slave ship diagram modeled as a replica of the Brooks slave ship, "Having heard all of this, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know." And at Wilberforce's arm when he said this was his lieutenant in Parliament, Florence Nightingale's grandfather. To be able to make charts like this, Nightingale needed data. Nightingale not only imagined the needed comparison, but she was able to get the military and civilian data and do the math that made this simple, clear chart possible. When we read the hundreds of letters related to these diagrams, we can see that most of the discussion, most of the effort is about how to access data and how to fairly do analysis. The math of statistics is not particularly hard. Most of this is just addition and subtraction. But what gets counted and what gets left out matters a lot. Determining what is appropriate and what is useful is not easy at all. They cannot wait for the official Army mortality data of record to be blessed by the government. So Nightingale and her circle of reformers needed to make their own database. They hustled military officers and medical statisticians to get the Army data they needed. And this is what their source data looked like. At war, deaths were variously recorded by the commander who lost fighters, the ferryman who lost passengers, the medical officer who lost patients, and the adjutant who buried bodies. High-quality data sources should each independently show the same number of total deaths, but comparing all of these data revealed large differences. The data was not standardized. It was not centralized. It was incomplete, poor quality. The data was a mess. But that didn't stop Nightingale. Ultimately, she would cite 6 different data sources. She did the best she could with the data she had, and at the same time, worked to implement better data practices so that future data would be more useful. So that's where the soldier data came from, the red bars. For the black bars, Nightingale would recruit William Farr. Now, William Farr was the best statistical talent that England had to offer at the time. He matched Nightingale's motivation and wit with his expertise in health data, analysis, and data visualization. He balanced Nightingale's affection for the Army with his own concern for the broader civilian population. And William Farr brought the civilian data. This is what Farr's data looked like. He was the top statistician in the government agency responsible for the recording of vital statistics, births, deaths, and marriages. The stacks of his registration volumes stretched for miles underneath London. It was called a great library of the dead and living. The vaults ran far beyond the extent of the buildings above, so far that they seemed to vanish to a point. These miles of volumes were distinguished: red for births, green for marriage, black for death. The white walls, colorful volumes, lamplight, and dim noise of carriage traffic above created an impression described in a contemporary magazine as one of the most wonderful, most solemn, and most imposing features of all of London. The creative collaboration and friendship between William Farr and Florence Nightingale is legendary in the history of information graphics. Together, they pushed their work beyond what either was capable on their own. You know, thinking about Farr, Nightingale wrote this: "Whenever I am infuriated, I revenge myself with a new diagram. And Dr. Farr, in whose hands I have placed a copy of this data table, is constructing a very pleasing curve." And Farr wrote glowingly of Nightingale. To her, he wrote, "I have read with much profit your admirable observations. It is like shining light in a dark place." Farr and Nightingale looked up to Adolphe Quetelet, the Belgian champion of moral statistics, a religious belief that populations could be studied to reveal regular patterns that were impossible to see at the individual level. Today, we call moral statistics social science. They believed they were on a godly mission to find these patterns, these social laws, and use them to improve society. Incredibly, a draft of this bar chart survives. When we look at it, the hand-drawn draft, we can see that the original color palette was blue-black, not black-red. It got changed to that red color, further indicating the intentional storytelling power of linking the soldiers to the British redcoat red. And when we zoom in on both the published chart and the hand-drawn diagram, we can see that it's signed by James Lewis. Now, James Lewis worked at the General Register office underneath Farr. He was one of Farr's clerks. Farr brought his own team, including Lewis, to help process data and produce the diagrams. Nightingale explicitly understood this team as a competitive advantage. They had talent, but they also had the scale to do the data analysis and data visualization. And even more importantly, if she had Farr and his team, then her competitors would not benefit from Farr. Nightingale also relied on a rich network of support. She had technical and science advisors. She had a personal secretary to coordinate production, and she personally funded and managed all the actual printing. The bar chart is a simple example of something that Nightingale really excelled at, persuading with easy to understand comparisons. Her text, tables, and charts are at their best when they present these simple comparisons. The army versus civilians, the army abroad versus the army at home, this regiment versus that regiment, wounds versus disease, the English versus the French, or most famously, before versus after. Now, this is the first batch of diagrams or data visualization that Farr and Nightingale produced. It was published in early 1858, and it was first published in an official government report that Nightingale co-authored with Sidney Herbert. And it was immediately published in a second publication, a large format folio published independently by Nightingale. But the finished reports were just the beginning of their work. Nightingale and Herbert knew that for them to improve practice, they would need support from across society. 1858 began with the reformers promoting their new publications. They sent them to collaborators, politicians, doctors, Crimean colleagues, clergy, and other opinion leaders. She arranged the distribution directly through her printer. Then, they positioned reviews by their allies across a series of periodicals. Nightingale advised Herbert how to match each chosen reviewer's talents, medicine, sanitation, statistics, or humor, to the publication. Even Charles Dickens was on their list. The resulting press was astounding. The newspapers quoted that the terrible results of the carelessness and ignorance manifested so clearly and vividly in those awful diagrams. They called the diagrams perfectly appalling, and they said that the diagrams must be seen to be believed. Now, Nightingale and her circle of reformers went on to produce more diagrams and more publications. In addition to the original two, across the following year and a half, they would publish 3 more publications with Crimean War diagrams arguing for reform. In these next 3 diagrams was a second batch. In the next 3 publications was a second batch of diagrams. Now, this batch of diagrams started with a new polar area chart format that showed total deaths across the months of the war. And when you read this, you were supposed to ask, well, so many people are dying, what are they dying from? And the second chart answered. It was the cause of death. And it revealed that most people were dying from preventable causes, from preventable diseases. This second chart is the one that has become an icon and made Nightingale famous as a passionate statistician. The final chart showed that a solution had been found: sanitary reform. Here's all of Nightingale, Farr, Herbert's, and the rest of the team diagrams. Now, we can place all of these diagrams as a particularly salient artifacts of a decade-long fight for sanitary reform. And today, we can look back and see that in Great Britain, life expectancy has doubled since the time that they were fighting for this reform. The author, Stephen Johnson, credits 3 main innovations for this doubling of life expectancy: vaccines, starvation busting, agricultural revolution, and finally, sanitary reform, especially through better sewers. Understanding the various contributing voices across the publications is maybe too complicated for today. I hope that what I've given you is a sense of the scale of the effort required. You know, it's easy to think of historic data visualization as products of a lone genius toiling away in their workshop. But this is rarely the case. Alexander von Humboldt, Emma Willard, W.E.B. Du Bois, they all had their workshop elves to help process data, draft stories, and print finished graphics. And all of this was very, very expensive. If you ever wonder why any one effort stopped, it's often because the cash ran out. Very wealthy people and very wealthy empires invested to make some of our most famous information graphics possible. Now, I want to return and end talking about Nightingale's and Farr's friendship. Now, they're in that first batch of diagrams. They published this. And this diagram is a comparative bar chart segmented by cause of death. And what it shows is that you have English male population, the civilians at the top, infantry of the line, the soldiers at the bottom. And it really highlights with that hollow rectangle on the top right how many deaths, were how many excess deaths there were in the military compared to the soldiers who are not at war but just living in barracks at home in England. Now, years later, Nightingale and Farr returned to this diagram, and she wrote to Farr, "My dear Farr, could you kindly further the growth of your own child," meaning the diagram, and revise it. And what she wanted to do was update this diagram with new data. And Nightingale sent Farr the idea for a new diagram. She sent Farr the data for the new diagram, and she also explained, "This is what I want to do. I want to publish it and say, this is how he found the army, and this is how he left it." And who were they talking about? They were talking about the third member of their creative trio, Sidney Herbert. Because you see, Sidney Herbert was not alive to see this revision of their original diagram, as he died very young, tragically, of kidney disease. This is a revision that accompanied that letter, and it showed how Nightingale actually wanted the diagram to be revised. You can see lots and lots of marks, probably both to Farr and also to the printers as these documents went back and forth through the mail and they improved. What's incredible about this last Crimean War diagram is the letter and the diagram gives us insight into how they actually work. And the resulting diagram, published in 1863, looks like this. It says, the diagram, the English male population, the infantry of the line before, and then finally the infantry of the line after, showing that the soldier mortality had indeed decreased thanks to all of their reform. Now, years later, Mary Farr, William Farr's daughter, recounted what it was like when Florence Nightingale would visit their house to work with William Farr, her father. And she told a story. "My father said, 'Well, if you do it, you will make yourself enemies.' And she drew herself up and answered," she meaning Florence Nightingale. And Nightingale said, "After what I've seen, I can fire my own guns." And so when we think about social reform, social progress, what I take from the Nightingale-Farr collaboration is the amount of work they put into it, the persistent effort over years in order to achieve, what they saw as possible, what they envisioned. For this reason, I consider that these two people, are visionaries. And as you also work on whatever you're working on, I hope that, like Nightingale and Farr, you're also persistent in your efforts, but also consider the question, compared to what? There's no such thing as a datum, the singular of data. It's all data. We need context. We need comparisons. No one understood the persuasive power of simple comparisons better than Florence Nightingale. So I want to throw this now back to Alistair because I know that we have quite a lot to talk about. Thank you so much.